Hey everyone, it's Jacob, and I'm here today to cover a new faction for the mod Ice and Fire Total War, War for Westeros. This is a mod for the game Total War that tells the overhauls and bases in Westeros, the primary setting of Game of Thrones, House of the Dragon, and the Song of Ice and Fire books. In particular, this mod is based off of the books, with the units and factions in it taking inspiration from their book counterparts as compared to the live action shows, which is something I appreciate. Because this mod chooses to discard the visual style of the show, it means a lot of the units in the game look more historically authentic for starters, which is nice to see. In this video I'll be breaking down the faction of the Reach, specifically the sole house that has in its roster House Tyrell, looking at the history and inspiration behind the faction in its roster, before turning to its units and looking at how historically authentic the units' arms and armor are. If you like the sounds of that and want to see more, like and subscribe, and the content will keep coming. As of making this video, the mod is in the very early alpha. However, even at such a stage, a lot of factions, units, and maps already exist, which means there's more than enough content for me to cover for a while. Looking at the Reach, it's one of the southernmost realms in the Seven Kingdoms, the second largest behind the north, and considered the breadbasket of Westeros, which is why the area has by far the largest population of all the kingdoms, meaning it can field the largest army too, which is important given it borders the Westerlands, the Riverlands, the Crownlands, the Stormlands, and Dorne, meaning its borders are more than exposed. For millennia, the Reach was ruled by House Gardner. However, during the Targaryen conquest of the continent, the Gardner king and all his heirs would die, leaving the Reach in the lurch. It was the stewards of House Gardner, House Tyrell, who would surrender to the Dragon Lords and would be raised to become the Wardens of the South and the ruling House of the Reach. For centuries, the Tyrells would hold this position, fighting in Robert's rebellion as loyalists to the Targaryens, while after the death of the Mad King and his heir Rhaegar, the Tyrells would surrender to Robert Baratheon. During the War of the Five Kings, House Tyrell would initially back Renly Baratheon, marrying Margaery Tyrell to the potential king, although after his death, the Reach would ally with House Lannister, giving them their strength to tip the balance of the war in their favour. As of the most recent book, the alliance between House Tyrell and the Lannisters are breaking due to the machinations of Varys the Spider and Cersei Lannister's poor leadership, with the Reach being attacked by the Ironborn while the Tyrell army marches south to allegedly confront the Golden Company in its invasion of Westeros. In terms of historical inspiration for the faction, the main one that I can see is medieval France, which much like the Reach, was considered the birthplace of chivalry and was known for having a large number of knights compared to neighbouring nations. With all that said, we'll turn to the units, beginning by looking at the generals. Each faction normally having a heavy cavalry unit as a general, which is normally a regular unit in the roster, as well as a unique character from the books leading their own unique unit. In this case, the unique general for House Tyrell is Sir Loras Tyrell, a teenager known as the Knight of the Flower, who is famous for being an impeccable lancer, who after the marriage of his sister Margaery to King Joffrey Baratheon, ends up joining the King's Guard, although he is purportedly on death's door after leading the assault to capture Dragonstone from Stannis' garrison. Looking at Loras, he rides a beautifully armoured horse, his steed having a shanfron decorated with green enamelling in the shape of roses and thorns for head protection, with a similarly decorated patral and croupier protecting the chest and rear of the horse. Overall, the horse resembles the heavily armoured horses of the 15th and 16th centuries, but isn't as fully armoured as the full barge used by the richest nobility historically. As for Loras himself, he wears an armlet with a feathered crest atop it, armlets being a late 15th and 16th century helmet which was considered by some the peak of helmet development during the medieval era and was considered exclusively reserved for the heaviest and most elite of cavalry. For his torso, Loras wears an arming shirt with mail sleeves and skirt, over which he wears an articulated plate cuirass which is gilded and etched with golden roses, folds being attached to protect the upper legs. For his arms, he relies on gilded pauldrons, with one of the pauldrons having a golden rondel attached for extra armour, rear braces covering his upper arms, while cowders, van braces, and articulated gauntlets protect his forearms and hands. For his legs, Loras has plate cuirasses, gilded patrals, and greaves, with sabatons finishing off his look. Overall, Loras looks like a man-at-arms from the early 16th century, which stands at odds with his weapon and shield. Loras using an arming sword that looks like it could have seen service in the 1300s, alongside a heater shield rimmed with metal and painted green and gold with Tyrell rose adorning it. Heater shields were used by cavalry. However, by the time armour progressed to the point it looked like Loras's, such heavy cavalry ditched shields, relying on their heavy armour to protect them, so it would make little sense for Loras to use a shield. The heater shield being off too, given that it has a metal rim, heater shields historically lacking rims compared to kite shields and round shields, which often did have them. Turning to the Household Guard, they too ride similarly armoured horses, though theirs have a mix of enamelled and bare barding. To a man, they all wear similar plate armour harnesses like the one used by Loras, however all of them are highly enamelled with green in the shape of roses and thorns, some of the men having the yellow rose of House Tyrell also enamelled on their chest. That said, not all the men have identical decoration on their armour, some leaving their legs and forearms undecorated, while others are a variety of colour, all however having golden coronals atop their helmets, with green feathers sticking out showing off the ostentatious wealth and pageantry of the Reach. For weapons, all the men use lances, with some having green pennants on them, using the same shield as Loras. Overall, as a unit, these men resemble the gendarmes of 15th and 16th century France, being almost as armoured as is humanly possible, meaning the heaviest shot cavalry on the battlefield. As a silver tier 2 heavy shot cavalry unit, I'd recommend these guys as your general, not only due to the unique nature of having the Knight of Flowers as your general, but also because the unit hits above its weight and is more devastating than the other option available to the faction. I said the best use of these guys in a reserve or as a spear tip of your mounted forces, blowing a bloody path through enemy armies which they're more than capable of. With Loras Tyrell and his household guard covered, let's turn to the regular troops in the roster, starting with the Tyrell crossbowmen. To a man, they all wear salays, a widely popular form of helmet used in Western Europe during the 15th century, wearing a mix of either green gambeson with male standards over the top, male shirts with gambeson over the top, or male shirts with standards worn underneath brigandines for their torsos, making for very well armoured men. We'll touch on the colour of the armour worn by these men, as it's something that's an absolute win for this mod when it comes to historical accuracy. Armour, and indeed military outfits of all kinds were for the most part brightly decorated and richly coloured all the way up until the First World War, where firepower made standing out extremely dangerous, as the French army especially, with their red and blue outfits, found out. As such, seeing men wearing coloured armour is nice to see compared to a lot of other mods or even general depictions of medieval armour in pop culture, where the armour tends to be either grey, brown or black. That said, these men uniformly wearing green is a bit off, as armies only really began to have standardised uniforms in the 18th century, although units being colour coded is an issue that is seen in all factions in this mod. Overall, what I'm saying is, while I love the green, other colours could have been mixed in there to give the unit variety. Apart from that, some of the men wear leather gloves while others lack them, some having greaves while others have pollens and cuisses instead, all wearing leather boots. Appearing to lack sidearms in case of melee, although they do have short swords and daggers, the main weapon of these men is the crossbow, their examples having more simple wooden shafts compared to the highly ornate examples from the late Middle Ages. Crossbows were widely used during the medieval era due to the ease of building them and training someone to be proficient with one. Construction only really requiring readily available wood and metal compared to longbows, which required especially aged wood with just the right characteristics for the use as a weapon. Longbows too taking many years to become skilled with compared to a crossbow which took a few weeks to a few months, making them a very attractive choice for military commanders, especially given their longer range compared to bows and ability to punch through armour, although they were far slower when it came to rate of fire. As such, the weapon was ubiquitous, and despite bans attempting to stop its use, it saw constant use everywhere, with some regions becoming famed for their professional crossbowmen, such as Genoa in Italy. Given the reach as the largest army in Westeros, it makes sense that such an easily trainable weapon would see considerable service in its armed forces, the men using it looking like crossbowmen and support infantry from the 15th century. Looking at the unit officer, he wears a sallet with a bever and a visor, his visor being gilded to show off his wealth, feathers crowning his helmet. For body armour, he appears to have a male byrnie over which he wears green silk robes, which were used as armour historically and which were surprisingly effective, over which he wears a plate cuirass etched with a golden rose, a half-cloak being worn on his back, gilded pauldrons being worn over the shoulders, while rear braces, cowders, van braces, and articulated gauntlets keep his arms safe, cuisses, gilded pollens, and greaves and sabatons protecting the legs, giving him a 15th century appearance, an arming sword with a dainty crosspiece in his hands being used alongside a somewhat square shield that resembles a cut-down Roman scutum with a raised top edge or a small pavise, the shield being rimmed with metal and decorated with the gold rose of House Tyrell. Similar types of shield did see heavy use in the late Middle Ages, when armour such as this was fielded, so it's not too impractical for the officer to use such a shield, although realistically it'd be better off dropping the shield and instead using a polearm. As a unit, the Silver Tier 2 light crossbow infantry provide your armies with plentiful range striking power, only to contend with most foes. A powerful unit if used properly. My main issue with these guys is that they shoot at flat angles, meaning they can easily have their line of sight blocked, rendering them ineffective. As such, I wouldn't solely rely on them as the heart of your ranged arm, I would instead mix them with the next unit as they're still useful regardless of that limitation. That next unit would be the Tyrell longbows, who are identically equipped to the Tyrell crossbows except for their weapon, the longbow. Longbows are most well known for their use by English and Welsh longbowmen during the high to late Middle Ages, although the weapon was used in continental Europe and Scotland to a limited degree. It makes sense that the Tyrell army would field such troops given how populous the reach is. It would be impossible for there not to be a sizable numbers of men trained with the weapon. Skipping the officer, as a unit, these Silver Tier 2 light archers complement your crossbowmen, giving you a very fleshed out ranged force, capable of combining firepower to put out maximum damage possible. Personally, I'd recommend mixing and matching these guys, the longbowmen being better suited at shooting above the heads of your troops into enemy formations, while the flat firing of the crossbowmen make them highly devastating when attacking enemies without cover. Overall, two units that complement each other well and should see widespread use in the armies of House Tyrell. Moving on to the next unit, we have the High Guard and Pikemen, who are heavily armoured infantry, wearing salets with bevers and gorgets to protect the upper chest. Gorgets were worn under chest armor such as breastplates, not over it. This is a common and accurate trend to see, not only in this mod but in pop culture in general. For their torsos, apart from the gorgets, the men wear a mix of various armor, some having male shirts over gambeson, over which they wear padded surcoats, while others just wear gambeson, some choosing to wear male shirts with brigandine cuirasses over the top, while others instead of gambeson with elements of plate armor being worn over it, such as placards protecting the stomach. For their arms, they too see an equal range of variety, some having pauldrons and spolders for their upper arms, others have mail sleeves with pauldrons, and others have spolders and rear braces. Some having van braces and articulated gauntlets, while others wear leather gloves, and some lack forearm armor entirely, apart from their gambeson sleeves. Brigandine pauldrons also making an appearance. For the legs, the men wear pollens and greaves, some having cuisses for the upper legs while others lack them, all wearing leather boots instead of sabatons. For weapons, the men discard shields and instead choose to use two hands to wield pikes. These pikes having metal bands on the shaft for extra strength and having smaller, more practical pike heads reminiscent of real life examples. I will say that compared to the other pikes in the mod, they seem longer, although that much might be me misremembering or getting the length wrong in my head. Overall, these men resemble heavy infantry of the 15th and 16th centuries, men who weren't quite as well armoured as knights and nobility, but were still well equipped regardless, being very faithful to how pikemen of this period would have been equipped. Skipping their officer, these silver tier 2 medium pike infantry have the potential to make up the core of your army if a predominantly pike-oriented force is what you're going for. Otherwise, you can use them in the front line of your army as an armoured core to bulldoze through enemy forces, though no matter how you deploy them, take care to have spearmen on their flanks to keep them safe from cavalry, who will destroy them if caught out of formation. Archers too being a major threat due to their lack of shields. Overall though, this unit is a menace both to horsemen and infantry, made even more dangerous than siege and holding choke points, leading me to more than suggest including it in your armies. Turning to the next unit, the Tyrell and men-at-arms make an appearance. Armoured identically to the previous unit, these men choose to use the same shields as those used by the officers seen previously, alongside 15th century arming swords which look to be better specialised for stabbing enemies in the gaps of their armour. Skipping the officer, these troops again look like heavy line infantry of the late Middle Ages, although I am disappointed that they only use arming swords, as a mix of axes and maces would have been nice, showing a bit of variety in the equipment would have been much more authentic both the history and the A Song of Ice and Fire books, when men-at-arms are described using weapons other than arming swords quite often, various kinds of swords like falchions being a nice weapon to include in this unit's armament. That brings me to another problem that I have with this unit, that being its name. This is a complaint that if you've been watching this series you've heard multiple times, but men-at-arms weren't regular infantry. Men-at-arms are heavy cavalrymen from the late Middle Ages who were equivalent to knights on the battlefield, many knights being men-at-arms. The idea that men-at-arms means regular soldier is wrong. However, for many decades that idea has been perpetuated in books, games, movies and TV shows, so it's not hard to see why the mod creators have called the unit that, especially when in the source material for the mod they're referred to as such. In a way then, the mod creators are being highly authentic to their source, while also being ahistorical. Moving on to the unit role, this unit more so than any others what the Reach and House Tyrell are known for, fielding massive amounts of men-at-arms compared to their neighbours in the Seven Kingdoms. The bulk of your army, these silver tier 2 medium melee infantry are more or less a match for most equivalent enemies, with the heart of your offensive infantry, waves of these guys crashing into enemy spear walls and breaking them, grinding their way through castle defences bit by bit. Overall, a very tough unit that will see considerable amount of use in the Tyrell army, be it on the defensive or on the offensive. Moving on, we come to a unit that perplexes me, the Tyrell Macemen. Armoured identically to the men-at-arms, these men use the same shields in conjunction with a mix of different maces, some of them being more rounded flanged maces, while others are spiky bores, and others are your more typical spiky flanged mace with a square head. Some with wooden shafts and others using metal, all however being the perfect one-handed weapon with which to kill armoured foes, maces excelling at bypassing heavy armour by crushing the enemy inside. As a weapon, maces saw growing use as armour evolved and plate armour began to spread, the use of shields making sense for these men given that they want something to defend them from enemies potentially using the same weapon as them, given a mace would be just as devastating on these guys. Skipping the unit officer, my main note on these guys is why do they exist as a separate unit? In my opinion, it would have been far better to have the Tyrell men-at-arms use a mix of these maces as well as swords rather than reserving maces for a specific unit. Regardless, the silver tier 2 mace infantry are better suited to killing armoured foes than their sword-equipped counterparts, and I suggest mixing a few of these guys into your army to give you additional strength when fighting well-armoured elite foes. Overall, a useful unit, but not necessarily one that I think should exist. Moving on to the next unit, we have the Tyrell Spear Sergeants. Armoured the same as the past couple units and using the same shields as them, these men use spears as their main weapon, their spears resembling Yari to some degree with their sharp, straight point. Skipping the officer, these silver tier 2 medium spear infantry are the bulk of your defensive infantry, being perfectly suited to holding the line against enemy offensive, be it on the open battlefield or sieges, buying time for the rest of your army to roll up the enemy line, being a perfect counter to marauding cavalry as long as they're not caught out of formation. A tough solid unit, they're not battle winners, but they do help set the stage for your victories. Overall a unit that will almost always have a home in the Tyrell army. Turning to the next unit, the Tyrell Outriders make an appearance. Essentially the Tyrell men-at-arms mounted on unarmoured horses. The unit officer more or less wears the same armour as Renly's household guard, but without any enamelling, instead wearing a tabard over his armour showing off the green rose of House Tyrell, a lance with a massive pennant in one hand and a heater shield with an inaccurate metal rim in the other, compared to his men who use arming swords and essentially small pervisors. As a unit, these silver tier 2 medium melee cavalry are better suited at catching out and destroying enemy shock cavalry, being able to endure slogfest more easily than shock cavalry who excel at cycle charging. As such, I'd suggest including a fair number of these guys into your army to serve as anti-cavalry cavalry, destroying your enemy's mounted strength before then wheeling around to hit the enemy in the rear alongside your own shock cavalry. If a pure cavalry army is what you're going for, which is more than possible to this faction, just increase the amount of these guys fielded. As useful as these guys are, however, this is another unit that suffers from the problem of having a really inaccurate name. Outriders in their Song of Ice and Fire universe are lightly equipped scouts. What they are not is mounted men-at-arms, which is what these guys are. As such, I'd recommend renaming these guys Tyrell mounted men-at-arms because that far more accurately fits what they are and is more loyal to the source material. Overall though, a very useful unit, albeit with an inaccurate name. Moving on, we come to the catapults, which are fielded by the Tyrell longbowmen without bows for all intents and purposes when it comes to armour. As a unit, the catapults give your armies immense range power, allowing you to bombard enemy armies or fortifications as you wish, being equally useful both as an attacker, opening up holes in the walls, and destroying arrow towers so it will allow you to take fortifications without resorting to taking them by storm and suffering excessive casualties. Or on the defensive, where you can thin out enemy numbers and destroy siege equipment including enemy artillery with counterfire. Overall, this is a unit that, while more useful in sieges, is one that if it was found to be missing in your roster, would make battles that much harder to win. Moving on to the next unit, we have the High Guard and Guards of Thorns. Or to a man equipped like the regular unit officers, these troops are distinguished by their lack of gilding on their pauldrons and gauntlets as well as the leather boots that they wear rather than sabatons. Apart from that, the men also drop shields and relegate their arming swords to their side, their main weapon being essentially a gilded halberd, all the men's weapons having a spear tip and an axe blade on at least one side, with some of the weapons having a smaller axe blade designed for hooking on one side, with others of the same axe blade on both sides. These halberds are very similar weapons, or highly ceremonial, more like the kind of thing used by court guards rather than by troops on the battlefield, although these weapons would make for devastating multi-use weapons, hooking and hacking foes apart while being capable of stabbing enemies and fending off horsemen, which is why such polearms were widespread use during the late Middle Ages and the early modern period, often alongside pikes. Skipping the officer, these gold tier 3 very heavy shock infantry are an excellent unit to include in your army as a spear tip of your infantry forces, covering a path through enemy weak points which are then exploited by your masses of men-at-arms and macemen. A highly useful unit due to their heavy armour, they're more durable when it comes to ranged foes compared to most shock infantry, although again, I'd exercise caution and leave these guys in the rear and use them as a reserve rather than throw them into the front lines at the beginning of a battle. Moving on, we come to a very unique unit in the mod, the Thornwatch. For armour, these men tend to wear a mix of gambeson and mail similar to the Tyrell longbowmen, with van braces and greaves also seeing use. The men lacking a helmet, however, wearing a hooded mantle with a veil for the face, which while disappointing when it comes to head protection makes sense for a stealth unit. Arming swords and daggers being dual wielded in case of melee, or for ranged combat the men use crossbows. Skipping their officer, as a unit, they silver tier 2 light crossbowmen are, as I said previously, a stealth unit which can guerrilla deploy ahead of your army, allowing you to ambush enemy forces while keeping these guys safe from marauding horsemen with cavalrymen of your own. A highly unique unit, this is the only professional stealth unit I can think of in the mod, although I think there might be a couple others, with some other factions having starting units with the stealth capability. As a unit, I suggest maybe incorporating a couple of these guys into your army to ambush enemy forces and to fall back to your main ranged force and reinforce them, being a generally very useful unit who gives House Tyrell extra firepower no one expected it to possess. Moving on from them, we come to the next unit, the Lancers of High Garden. Riding unarmoured horses, for armour these men have salets with bevers and visors, making their heads very well armoured. A gorget being worn over their plate cuirasses, which we've spoken about, some of the cuirasses bearing the Tyrell rose while others lacked them. The plate seemingly being worn over silk shirts or worn over mail shirts with rondels protecting the armpit. Pauldrons, rear braces, cowders, van braces and a mix of articulated gauntlets and leather gloves keep the hands safe, while mail pants with cuisses, pollens and greaves do the same for the legs. Some of the men are wearing leather boots while others have mail shoes. Lacking shields, these men have arming swords at their side, but use as their main weapon lances, with the lances having a bronze spike at the bottom, allowing the weapon to potentially be used twice when charging. Skipping the officer who seems to be identical to the officer leading the Tyrell Outriders, these silver tier 2 medium shock cavalry will make up the core of your cavalry forces, especially in the mid-game. Chivalry and the horsemen that come with it are what the Reach is known for, and here we see a good example of it. This being a unit that can equally serve as the mounted arm of your forces or be the core of a completely mounted army, something very few factions can claim to be able to pull off effectively. Overall, a great unit, even if the horses are less armoured than I'd like, being a great example of lancers who aren't necessarily as heavily armoured as the best equipped nobility, but still pack a punch. Moving on to the next unit, the dismounted Rose Knights make an appearance. Essentially Renly's household guard but dismounted, these men have rondel daggers at their side for stabbing enemies in the gaps of their armour during melee. However, their main weapon is the mighty poleaxe they all wield. Of all polearms, by far the most knightly, these are meant to be used to absolutely destroy armoured opponents, having a spear tip for stabbing enemies, a heavy axe blade for carving through mail and textile armour like nothing, with a hammer at the back of the weapon for smashing through plate with ease, some having hammers more like spikes at the back meant for piercing enemy armour while still crushing them. A fantastic weapon, these poleaxes have metal on their shafts for extra reinforcement, while the bottom of the shaft is shod in metal, allowing you to bash away at the enemy with the bottom of the weapon if necessary. More so than any unit we've seen today, this unit shows off the epitome of wearing armour to the point you can discard shields can allow you to do, making these knights that much more formidable than they had been equipped with a shield and sword. Skipping the officer who's distinguished only by his green cloak over his shoulders, these gold tier 3 super heavy shock infantry are one hell of an asset to have in your army, ripping enemy formations to pieces. Given their heavy armour, archers aren't really a concern, with only cavalry really being a threat, although these guys will make quick work of stuck cavalry. A horrific unit to have to face on the battlefield, these guys are the Reach's equivalent of the Winter Wolves, and really help show off the technological gap when it comes to armour between the north and the south. In battle, these guys are more so than any other the perfect unit to lead your assault infantry into the fray, being amazing at cutting a path through enemy lines when on the offensive or blunting enemy attacks and forcing them to retreat in sieges. Overall, an amazing unit for the late game which does what it's meant to and does it well. Moving on to the next unit, we have the High Guard and Knights. Riding horses as armoured as those ridden by Loras and his household guard, albeit not decorated with green enamelling as some of the horses having unicorn spikes built into their armour, these men are equipped like the mounted officers of the other unit to a man, although some wear silk shirts bearing the Tyrell crest over their armour entirely, rather than wearing a surcoat or a tabard, or using a heater shields, arming swords and lances. Skipping the officer who seems identical to his men, these gold tier 3 very heavy shock cavalry are the knights that the Reach is famed for. Their elite reputation being well warranted as these men can run roughshod over almost all competition, also being capable of serving as faction general, although I'd recommend the Knight of Flowers and his household guard over these guys purely due to having better stats, although if you want a more standard general, you can't go wrong with them. More so a late game army unit, these guys will serve as a spear tip of your mounted forces, then your lances of high guarding into battle, be it your cavalry wing or as a leading element of your entire army. Either way, the unit is devastating, although archers and spearmen are a major threat, so care should be taken to destroy those enemy assets first. Maneuverability and hitting power being the name of the game when fielding mounted units, especially if you're going with a completely mounted army. Turning to our final unit, we have the greatest knights of the Reach in House Tyrell, the Rose Knights, essentially Loras Tyrell's household guard both when it comes to horses and riders. These men are led by an officer who blends in with his men apart from his lance with a massive pennant on it. As gold tier 3 super heavy shock cavalry, these guys are as tough and elite as they come, being an iron fist who can break all in their path if the circumstances are right. Incredibly elite, they serve much the same role as the previous unit and only add to the wealth of horsemen you have available to you, very much being a late game unit which you'd include in your armies if the situation is dire enough. Arguably the heaviest cavalry in the mod, although there might be some contenders coming up in future videos. With these guys covered, all the units in the faction have been looked at, so we'll move on to the faction as a whole. Overall, House Tyrell of the Reach are a faction that tends to be pretty secure all around when it comes to potential weaknesses, specialising in the heaviest cavalry possible with hordes of supporting shock infantry and regular infantry, a healthy line of ranged units helping round them out. It makes sense that the largest army in the realm would be able to be good all around. The only real downside that I see to the faction being that its regular infantry might be a bit lacking in comparison to enemy infantry, which might be for balance, otherwise the faction would be overpowered. As such, while your infantry is adequate, it's your cavalry that are the real killers. Steamrolling enemy armies either with or without infantry support, complete cavalry armies more than being possible and very viable for these guys. Overall, so that as the situation stands, House Tyrell is seemingly basic, relying on a mix of horse and foot to win battles. In reality, however, cavalry requires an experienced player to pull off properly, especially when fielding a complete cavalry army, meaning that in comparison to some of the other factions looked at so far and coming up in the future, these guys are a bit more complex compared to the more basic House Stark or House Greyjoy. A great faction with a large roster. I can't wait to see the early game units that are most likely going to be added to it in the next update. If you guys have enjoyed this video and want to see more like it, let me know in the comments and please like and subscribe. I know it may not seem like much for such a small channel, it's massively appreciated. Rest assured more videos on this mod and others will be coming up in the future. With all that said, this is your host Jakov, signing out.